Hello, this is Krystal, and thank you for joining me for this week's First Chapter Friday. Today I will be kicking off a new series, Sanderson September. We're kicking off with the Mistborn series. Book 1 is The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson. Prologue. Ash fell from the sky. Lord Trusting frowned, glancing up at the ruddy midday sky as his servants scuttled forward, opening a parasol over Trusting and his distinguished guest. Ashfalls weren't that uncommon in the Final Empire, but Trusting had hoped to avoid getting soot stains on his fine new suit coat and red vest, which had just arrived via canal boat from Luthadel. Fortunately, there wasn't much wind. The parasol would likely be effective. Trusting stood with his guests on a small hilltop patio that overlooked the fields. Hundreds of people in brown smocks worked in the falling ash, caring for the crops. There was a sluggishness to their efforts, but of course that was the way of the Ska. The peasants were an indolent, unproductive lot. They didn't complain. They knew better than that. Instead, they simply worked with bowed heads, moving about their work with quiet apathy. The passing whip of a taskmaster would force them into dedicated motion for a few moments, but as soon as the taskmaster moved on, they would return to their languor. Trusting turned on the man standing beside him on the hill. One would think, Trusting noted, that 1,000 years of working in fields would have bred them to be a little more effective at it. The obligator turned, raising an eyebrow, the motion done as if to highlight his most distinctive feature, the intricate tattoos that laced the skin around his eyes. The tattoos were enormous, reaching all the way across his brow and up the sides of his nose. This was a full prelon, a very important obligator, indeed. Trusting had his own personal obligators back at the manor, but they were only minor functionaries, with barely a few marks around their eyes. This man had arrived from Luthadel with the same canal boat that had brought Trusting's new suit. You should see City Ska, Trusting, the obligator said, turning back to watch the Ska workers. These are actually quite diligent compared to those inside Luthadel. You have more direct control over your Ska here. How many would you say you lose a month? Oh, a half dozen or so, Trusting said. Some to beatings, some to exhaustion. Runaways? Never, Trusting said. When I first inherited this land from my father, I had a few runaways, but I executed their families. The rest quickly lost heart. I've never understood men who have trouble with their Ska. I find the creatures easy to control, if you show a properly firm hand. The obligator nodded, standing quietly in his gray robes. He seemed pleased, which was a good thing. The Ska weren't actually Trusting's property. Like all Ska, they belonged to the Lord Ruler. Trusting only leased the workers from his god, much in the same way he paid for the services of his obligators. The obligator looked down, checking his pocket watch, then glanced up at the sun. Despite the ashfall, the sun was bright this day, shining a brilliant crimson red behind the smoky blackness of the upper sky. Trusting removed a handkerchief and wiped his brow, thankful for the parasol's shade against the midday heat. Very well, Trusting, the obligator said. I will carry your proposal to Lord Venture, as requested. He will have a favorable report from me on your operations here. Trusting held in a sigh of relief. An obligator was required to witness any contract or business deal between noblemen. True, even a lowly obligator like the ones Trusting had engaged could serve as such a witness, but it meant so much more to impress Venture's own obligator. The obligator turned toward him. I will leave down the canal this afternoon. So soon? Trusting asked. Wouldn't you care to stay for supper? No, the obligator replied. Though there is another matter I wish to discuss with you. I came not only at the behest of Lord Venture, but to look in on some matters for the canon of Inquisition. Rumors say that you like to dally with your ska women. Trusting felt a chill. The obligator smiled. He likely meant it to be disarming, but Trusting only found it airy. Don't worry yourself, Trusting, the obligator said. If there had been any real worries about your actions, a still Inquisitor would have been sent here in my place. Trusting nodded slowly. Inquisitor. He'd never seen one of the inhuman creatures, but he had heard stories. I have been satisfied regarding your actions with the Ska woman, the obligator said, looking back over the fields. What I've seen and heard here indicate that you always clean up your messes. A man such as you, efficient, productive, could go far in Luthadel. A few more years of work, some inspired mercantile deals, and who knows? The obligator turned away and Trusting found himself smiling. It wasn't a promise or even an endorsement. For the most part, obligators were more bureaucrats and witnesses than they were priests. But to hear such praise from one of the Lord Ruler's own servants. Trusting knew that some nobility regarded the obligators as unsettling. Some even considered them a bother. But at that moment, Trusting could have kissed his distinguished guest. Trusting turned back toward the Ska, who worked quietly beneath the bloody sun and the lazy flakes of ash. Trusting had always been a country nobleman, living on his plantation, dreaming of perhaps moving into Luthadel itself. He had heard of the balls and the parties, the glamour and the intrigue, and it excited him to no end. I'll have to celebrate tonight, he thought. There was that young girl in the 14th hovel that he'd been watching for some time. He smiled again. A few more years of work, the obligator had said. But could Trusting perhaps speed that up if he worked a little harder? His Ska population had been growing lately. Perhaps if he pushed them a little bit more, he could bring in an extra harvest this summer and fulfill his contract with Lord Venture in extra measure. Trusting nodded as he watched the crowd of lazy Ska, some working with their hoes, others on hands and knees, pushing the ash away from the fledgling crops. They didn't complain. They didn't hope. They barely dared think. That was the way it should be, for they were Ska. They were. Trusting froze as one of the Ska looked up. The man met Trusting's eyes. A spark. No, a fire. Of defiance showing in his expression. Trusting had never seen anything like it. Not in the face of a Ska. Trusting stepped back reflexively. A chill running through him as the strange, straight-backed Ska held his eyes. And smiled. If you would like to know what happens next, you can check this title out on the Libby app. Please join me here next week as I read from the beginning of The Way of Kings, Book 1 in the Stormlight Archive. Thank you and have a great week.